Hello, I'm Faisal Pervez, a South Asia analyst at Stratfor, and this podcast is brought to you by Stratfor Worldview, the world's leading geopolitical intelligence platform. Individual, team, and enterprise memberships are available at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe.
It was like a company town we lived in, so the whole town lived or died based upon whether there were wars going on and we were selling weapons.
Welcome to the Stratfor podcast. I'm Paul Floyd. There's a book that came across my desk recently that caught my attention. Here at Stratfor, being a military analyst, we look at weapons all the time. And so when I saw A Girl's Guide to Missiles, I sort of stopped and got very interested and started to read it. And as I went through the book, it's very clearly a coming-of-age story and growing up in a very unique place. And so while it has an idyllic setting at some levels, it's also about growing up on a naval station called China Lake Naval Weapons Center. And I have that author with me here today, who is Karen Piper, who wrote A Girl's Guide to Missiles in 2018. Welcome to the Stratfor podcast, Karen Piper.
Thanks for having me. I'm actually a big fan of Stratfor. I've been using it for years just because I've known of it as the very reliable source of geopolitical information. So I go there to fact check my own information on your website often and read your articles. So I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. That's good to hear. I did not know what to expect when I picked up your book. To be honest, I had no idea where you were going to go with it, with the title A Girl's Guide to Missiles. And I was surprised, and I really enjoyed it. And I thought it was a very refreshingly honest take on your life and growing up in a very interesting circumstance.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
When you look at your book and you read through it, you clearly tell your life story, marking it with geopolitical events, whether we're talking about serious weapon systems all the way to sort of the Reagan presidency, so on and so forth. But you start the book, frankly, with a bang, forgive the pun, where you and your mom are actually visiting China Lake again, and you're walking along in the actual one of the test centers.
Yes, that's the scene where the guide warns us not to pick up any unexploded ordnance that we might see around, and there's a bunch of tourists that come in. It's one of the few ways people can get on the base, and photographers love to go there and take pictures of a petroglyph canyon. And so they were all rather shocked by this information, and my mom and I just kind of chuckled because we're used to living on the base.
Also interesting, you kind of initially delve in sort of the background of your family, which is pretty interesting, if you don't mind kind of expounding on that just a little bit.
So my dad and my mom met in Seattle. My mom's from Minnesota. My dad's from Michigan. My dad was in World War II. He was a navigator in World War II, and he went to school on the GI Bill because of that and became an aerospace engineer. And so they were married in Seattle and had us two kids. My dad got laid off because Boeing laid off 30% of its workforce in 1970. And so when we left Seattle, they actually had a sign up that said, a billboard that you see when you drive away that said, "When will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" And we ended up in China Lake because of that, because my dad was unemployed for 6 months and was sort of desperate for a job. And so that's how we got there.
I think one of the interesting things when I read your book that I identified with, sort of being a veteran myself, was this perspective on war that you write about consistently throughout the book. And especially initially as working for the defense industry, and you talk about war sort of driving business and being good for home life, sort of being this thing. And for a lot of people, I think that can be striking, and it's different, where, you have this very specific, war is not just this sort of abstract, terrible thing. It's actually looked at very differently when you're in that. It's part of your livelihood, if you will.
Yes. I mean, and it was like a company town we lived in. So the whole town lived or died based upon whether there were wars going on and we were selling weapons. And it was whether it was expanding or shrinking. That had a big impact I think, on the thinking of people in the town. For me, it was a little bit different because I was just a kid. And so one of the main, conflicts in the book is that I don't really understand what war is, and parents don't like to talk to their children about what war is. So I ended up being very much in the dark for much of my life, and turned into a little, spy trying to figure out what my parents were doing on the base. And I think ultimately that's what resulted in this book. And I had to rely on not only my parents because they wouldn't really talk, but I snuck around and found some of their notes. And then I went to the National Archives, and that's why there's a lot of history in my book, is because I pieced together the historical information too, just a way of getting access to what was going on where I grew up.
One of your summer internships, if I get this correctly, was spent in the payroll office, and you start to talk with a former Marine, or he actually might be he still was a Marine at the time. Excuse me. But as you get to know him, his perspective on Korea also starts to, I would say, maybe enlighten or inform your perspective on war.
Yeah, he was a great guy. I always wondered if he's still alive or if he read my book. He was so nice to me because I was a very shy, introverted kid, and he was just would storm in and just start jabbering away, uh, and talked a lot about, like a lot of vets do. Some like to talk about it, some don't. My dad talked about his war experiences constantly. This man needed to talk about his war experiences, I think. And I'm a teenager, and I was hearing these like horrifying stories about what went on during the Korean War. Um, but he was telling them almost like funny stories, so it to entertain a younger person. So it was a very, interesting introduction into like, that's what we're doing here. Because we never talked about my mom and dad. If anything, I just knew they made missiles, but it was so abstract because we didn't talk about Vietnam or what was going on there.
Part of the book is telling the story of your perspective on war. At first, as you say, as a child, you really didn't know, or it was filtered through your parents. You start to see the other side of that perspective in university life. And you start to change your opinions, sort of, and grow up around that to a certain level. And really, I would, from my point of view, change your perspective to a certain degree.
Oh, yeah, I flipped to the total opposite side. Because not only where I grew up, it was not only a military base, but I grew up in a small subset of that, which was a Southern Baptist school where I basically sat in these three-sided cubicles all day long and learned from packets of accelerated Christian education. So which is what they were called. So I wasn't socialized much, and everything seemed secret and weird, and I didn't understand what was going on. At the same time, I had a happy childhood, so it's confusing. When I went away to college, it really blew my mind, everything that's happening all around me. And I just learned to adapt to different cultures, I guess I would say. So wherever I went, I would like adapt and try to act like I'm fitting in. Well, I end up in Eugene, Oregon, which is like absolutely anti-war, pacifist, kind of hippie university at the time. And I'm, out there marching against wars. And so it's like, and I wouldn't call my parents because I didn't even know how to explain any of this to them. I just thought like, oh, I've become this rebel.
Well, you just mentioned there in your answer a little bit, most children grow up knowing exactly what their parents do, at least on a basic level. And I have a couple of family friends as well who grew up around Los Alamos, but growing up as a child and not being able to talk to your parents about what they do professionally, what's that like?
Frustrating. I was very frustrated as a child. I was very precocious. I always wanted to know everything that's going on, ask constant questions, and I felt like they couldn't tell me. And it wasn't only the military thing or the top secret thing, though that was probably the biggest part of it. But it was also they're Scandinavian, and Scandinavians don't like talk much anyway, so and aren't super emotional. So it could feel like beating my head against a wall, And I felt like that I was the too emotional person in the family, even though I was hardly at all, I think. So yeah, it was frustrating. It really spurred me into this book. I think was in me from like really early on, because just that the idea that I have to find out somehow.
Eventually the National Archives were able to get a lot of your parents' paperwork. What was that process like about sort of putting your parents' life back together and sort of doing detective work to figure out what they used to do?
And actually, the National Archives didn't give me my parents' paperwork because the DoD only declassifies things after 30 years. So I got all the way up to like 1970, which is when we moved there. And then they just stopped.
Oh, really?
And so I was like, but I was able to read. I mean, I became obsessed. I read everything in that archive about China Lake because it was so fascinating, especially about the people who worked on the Sidewinder missile before me. And I ran into a lot of really interesting characters. Like one of them was the guy who was obsessed with global warming, who had his funding cut off and had to go back to working on the Sidewinder. Howie Wilcox is his name. But so anyway, that was a bit frustrating. But I got more of my information from my parents actually, because my dad got Alzheimer's and he started letting things out that maybe he shouldn't be talking about. That was one way. And I started just pumping my mom for information. And the older she got, the less concerned she seemed to be in terms of talking about it. And she'd tell me these crazy stories, like out of the blue, like that one story where she said she put the missile in her trunk and drove to LA. Well, it was just the missile nose. But and she was so terrified, her hands turned white, they lost their blood, and so she stopped at a mall to go shopping.
It's always funny to me, like when you work on a job like that that's very unique. Everyone I've ever met who's been in this field, whatever you want to call it, has a story like that, where for whatever reason they're doing something ridiculous, like having a missile cone in the back of their car.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
it's weird how jobs work out that way sometimes. Um,
But she didn't know. Like she's like, what would I have told the cops if it gotten robbed?
Ignore the missile in the back. Don't worry.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
um, and I guess it should be said that your father worked on the Sidewinder and your mother mostly worked on Tomahawk missiles. That's correct.
Yes.
The Tomahawk specifically, you still see that weapon system be used consistently to this day. And I was just
Yeah.
curious how you could, when you see that happen with sort of U.S. strikes in Syria, for example, a couple of years back, does that give you a reaction? Does that make you sort of reflect on that in some sort of way?
My mom and I both will kind of go, "Oh, that's cool," which is just it's difficult. I think the reaction as a kid was like, "Oh, it's our weapons," or "You want them to work." But then every now and then, there was one time when my mom saw a missile that was used by her, and it hit a plane where you saw the people parachuting to the ground, and I don't think they lived. And that time she cried, and that was the first time I understood that, oh, maybe war isn't all happy and wonderful.
If you like the content of today's discussion, Stratfor Worldview is chock full of geopolitical content on topics like security, cybersecurity, the global power competition, and more. To subscribe, visit worldview.stratfor.com. Now, back to the studio.
When I was a young military guy, getting all that training, you want to go fight. And then when you start to see that human cost, if you will, that like a reference to your mom sort of seeing that vivid example of what a Tomahawk missile is really doing to people, it definitely sort of checks you up and is that a reality check to what you've been doing. So it's interesting to have a professional drive to and be proud of the profession you're in, but then understanding the cost of it can be a weird juxtaposition.
Yeah. Where did you serve, by the way?
I served in the Army, 75th Ranger Regiment.
What country, though, I mean?
Oh, I deployed several times. I deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq.
Oh, wow, intense. Okay.
So reflecting back, how would you sort of sum up your life in China Lake?
I still love China Lake because I love the desert so much. And it's the most beautiful place in the world. And I still think of it as my home, to be honest. The base has changed a lot since I was a kid. It's become much more fortified. So it's weird that when I go home, you can't just sort of traipse onto the base like I've done my whole life. So I feel sort of cut off from my childhood home. But I still think of it as a beautiful place with nice people. And there were good people there. That's the irony. There were good people who, the mission of the base was to develop weapons cheaply. And they were civil servants and they were extremely devoted to that. And there were big wars on the base between the civil servants and the contractors who wanted to make a big profit. And that sort of blew up and the contractors won. And now they don't even design weapons on the base anymore. So it's sort of sad that that happened.
Are they still testing weapons out there?
They test them now. Yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about specifically? I'd sort of open the floor to you if there's some place you'd like to talk about or make sure we point out about your book.
No, I think one thing that's been that I've been thinking about lately is this with the impeachment happening now. I started reading the impeachment chapters of my book at book readings because I have a couple Nixon impeachment chapters. The historical resonances are so fascinating to me because my dad was a big Nixon supporter and but the impeachment took a long time and it was a very hard time for the country. And it was hard, I think, in the sense that my dad, probably millions of Americans, were having to change their minds because my dad at one point suddenly decided, oh, he's not a good man. And it was when the tapes came out and he heard how he really talked. And so anyway, there's all these sort of deja vus happening for me now that are interesting.
But I really appreciated sort of your ability to tell your life, your personal life story through these geopolitical events and constantly tie them together. That was interesting to kind of mark big things in history with your life. Karen Piper is the author of A Girl's Guide to Missiles, Growing Up in America's Secret Desert, and also a Worldview subscriber. Karen, I'd really like to thank you for being on the Stratfor podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I could talk to you for hours about Iraq and Iran, but there's Afghanistan, but there's probably not time for that.
I have nowhere to be for a while, so if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to talk about it.
Were you in northern Iraq station?
No, the unit I was in.
So,
where have you been in Iraq?
Just the Kurdish part. That was in 2008. It was safe. So yeah, I was wondering when you were there and where.
I was there in 2008, but I was in Baghdad. My unit deployed in really short stints, but a lot. So I did 4 deployments to Iraq, and I did 4 deployments to Afghanistan total. So I did 8 total in my 8 years that I was in the Army. They weren't like the 18-monthers. These were like 3 to 6 months usually. And
I didn't know they did that. Okay.
Yeah, for certain units, it's just a different approach to try not to burn out people too much. But frankly, in its own way, it sort of burns you out because your whole life is rotating in and out very quickly. And in fact, when you talked about sort of going from college back to the base and doing those internships and how that was sort of jumping between 2 different worlds, that's something that resonated with me a lot because I was jumping from deployments back to civilian life, back to deployments on these 6-month hops.
And it's so surreal, yeah.
Yeah, and like it would be within 24, 48 hours. Surreal is the right word. It's hard to explain that to people. To answer your question, I was in Baghdad twice, and then I was also in Ramadi twice.
And what was your job?
So I was infantry. So I was in an infantry platoon. So I grew up through the ranks. I was enlisted. So I started out as just a rifleman and was a machine gunner, team leader, squad leader, all that fun stuff. The mission set that we had mostly was targeting high-value individuals, high-value targets.
Okay. Did you like Baghdad? Or do you get to even see any of it when you're in the military?
I didn't get to see much of it. I got to see more of Baghdad than probably the rest of my deployments. But they kept us. We were on reverse schedules, so we only went out at night. So my vision of Iraq and Afghanistan, frankly, is through a green hue, looking through night vision goggles.
Going out at night. That's amazing. Well, of course.
So I think my perspective on that space is different.
I heard it's a beautiful city. I wanted to go down there, but obviously it was too dangerous for me to go alone at that time. But you were there.
Well, the snapshots I did get during the day, it is pretty. It's a really neat city. And I actually hope to go back one day, and I hope you do too.
Yeah. Did you ever get up to Kurdistan?
No, I've never been to Kurdistan. The farthest north I ever went, I think, was... No, not even close, to be honest.
Oh, you got to check that out. It's so gorgeous up there. It's these green mountains and red poppies and totally different, I think.
Yes, it's definitely much more open and deserty, if you will, down south.
Yeah.
Unless you're around the rivers.
Yeah. See, I would love to see those rivers though. But so, I mean, I saw them in southeast Turkey, but so are you done now?
I am. I've been here at Stratfor for about 8 years. So I've been a civilian for that time, and I'm not. I entertained re-enlisting for a while there, but no, I came back, finished my college degree, and I've been working here ever since.
Yeah. Okay.
Like your dad, I took advantage of the GI Bill and
Oh, good for you. Okay.
parlayed it into something
Yeah,
else.
that's a great thing. Have you been following the Syria stuff?
Of course, very closely all the time. Or have you been to Syria? Or do you have a connection to it in any sort of
No,
way?
not Syria, but I spent about a month in Iraq and then all along the Syrian border in Turkey.
Okay.
Just so southeast Turkey, where all the Kurds are, and going up to the border with Iraq, and yeah, just in this whole southeast. So it's like I could see Syria from my hotel. And I just got a sense for the people there, like just fell in love with the Kurds. So that's the hard part.
Well,
I love chatting to vets and seeing this. Yeah.
Again, Karen, it was really nice meeting you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk
Yeah,
to you.
you too. Take care.
For more geopolitical intelligence and links to our content, follow us on Twitter @Stratfor. I'm Faisal Pervez. Thanks for listening.